All right, great. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm Laura Cascada. I'm the Senior Director of Campaigns with the Better Food Foundation. And today we are going to be sharing with you all everything plant-based defaults and nudges. And we hope that this presentation will really inspire you to incorporate these strategies into your work if you aren't already doing so, and answer a lot of your questions and provide some avenues for support for you all to keep moving forward with these strategies. And we'll introduce some information at the end for how we can keep collaborating with you and keep supporting you. So Better Food Foundation is an organization, a nonprofit that's working to create a world where plant-based foods are the norms. And our programs transform institutional and cultural environments. So we help guide food choices and shape attitudes about food. And these initiatives lead to large-scale and lasting improvements to the food system. And to get started, I wanted to go ahead and introduce our first speaker. So Björn Olafsson is with Funnelytics, and after studying psychology and human rights at the University of Chicago and the Center for Decision Research, Björn worked in education and science writing. He then investigated animal agriculture as a journalist for Sentient Media and other publications, reporting on greenwashing campaigns, alternative proteins, and animal science. As a research liaison for Funnelytics, Björn leads knowledge translation of Funnelytics' original studies, supports the research process from brainstorming to publishing, and connects with advocates to improve their activism through science-backed solutions. Outside of work, Björn is often trail running in the Icelandic Highlands or the Spanish Pyrenees, learning more languages, sewing outfits from scratch, or spending time with his two beloved lovebirds. So go ahead.
Thank you so much, Laura, for the introduction. I am going to be speaking about the science behind plant-based nudges and defaults and why they work. So let's get started. If you have any questions throughout my presentation, we're going to be answering questions at the end, but you can put them in the chat as we go. So let's jump into the science. And don't worry, if you're not a science person, this is going to be very easy to understand, I promise. So first, we're going to start with kind of the big question here, like why are we trying to reduce meat consumption? I'm sure many people probably already have an answer to this, but we should just go over it just in case. From a climate perspective, animal agriculture has a disproportionate impact on the environment and the climate for two primary reasons. The first reason has to do with the methane and other greenhouse gases that are expelled by cows. Because they are ruminant animals, they expel more greenhouse gases than most types of animals, including humans and chickens and other types of things. You've probably seen statistics about this. Most people have probably heard something. The average global carbon footprint of animal agriculture does vary from report to report. Overall, it tends to be between about 11% and about 20%, depending on how it is calculated. So if we look at a broad array of these statistics, we can see that it is a very significant amount of the world's global climate footprint. This is especially concerning because methane is an extremely potent greenhouse gas, but it also dissipates quite rapidly, which means that if we were to reduce animal agriculture in the short term, it would have outsized effects long term, which might be a very good thing. This is relatively well covered. However, these are the direct emissions of animal agriculture. Somewhat less covered tends to be the indirect problems, which has to do with land use and deforestation caused by animal agriculture. So if we look at this chart, we can see that of the habitable land that is on the earth, 45% of it is covered by agriculture. 80% of that figure is specifically related to animal agriculture and other animal products. We can see that of agricultural land, it takes up 80%, while only supplying 17% calories and 38% of protein. So a very inefficient use of our resources if we are to consider land as a resource here. Because of all of this land use, the meat industry is one of the leading causes of deforestation in nearly every region across the globe, from the Amazon to rainforest to Europe to North America to Africa. This is because to raise the animals for human consumption, the meat industry needs to create grains and soy and other crops to feed the animals, which needs a significant amount of land. I tend to find this is not as covered in the media and in education, these indirect uses. It uses 36% of total habitable land. And if we take both of these facts into account, according to one estimate, eliminating meat in the coming decades could offset up to 68% of all human-caused emissions if we take both direct and indirect uses into account. And here is the source for that statistic. At Faunalytics, we always make sure to have sources for everything that we say. We are very data-driven and evidence-based. So we can see here, 68% is an extremely large number. If we are to take sustainability seriously, we need to take meat seriously. We need to take production seriously and consumption. But I would be remiss if we didn't mention some of the other problems with meat consumption, including zoonotic disease. Over half of zoonotic diseases in the last 80 years have been driven by agriculture. Air pollution, this one is a US specific statistic, but about half of US air pollution is due to agriculture, primarily animal agriculture, often from the manure and feces of farmed animals. And then water use. 70% of global freshwater is used for agriculture. Again, disproportionately animal agriculture because it has a disproportionate amount of resources going into it. And then finally, as many people on this call are very much aware, animal welfare. Every year, 82 billion animals, this is only land animals, by the way, not including marine animals, are slaughtered for human consumption. I personally believe that their welfare and dignity is worth consideration from humans. So for these reasons, we need to think about meat consumption. But, okay, easier said than done, right? If we are to try and eliminate or reduce meat consumption in a way, I wish we could just go up to everybody and tell them to go vegan and that would solve the problem. Unfortunately, that might not be a very realistic scenario. So there are many interventions that can help with the consumption and production problems here. Defaults are one of them. And I'm about to jump into the science of how they work. So first, nudge theory. If you're not familiar with nudge theory, don't worry. It's relatively simple to understand. The idea at its most core essential bones, essentially, is that our choices emerge from our habits, environments, and biases that we have, not just purposeful, conscious thought. This can include if you wake up and you see what's in your fridge that day, you might not be consciously trying to create an epic meal from scratch. You might just kind of reach for the first thing that happens to be there. We can use this to nudge consumers into making more sustainable and ethical choices by essentially designing the environment to promote these choices. In a nudge, the choice is not removed entirely, but it is structured in a way where a certain choice is prioritized above the others without eliminating choice. So there are many types of nudges, and there are many types of nudges that can be employed for sustainable and ethical food choices. But today we're going to prioritize talking about plant-based defaults, which can also be called default veg or plant-based by default. In this scenario, the vegan option is positioned as the default option, where meat is only available upon request. So calling back to the theory, meat is still an option. It is not being taken away from the public. It is not being taken away from consumers. But we are creating a structure in which the more sustainable option is prioritized and more likely to be chosen. Okay, so what does this look like? I know this is a lot of like psychological theory here, so let's look at an example. This is an example from a university in the United States, Lee University, of the implementation of a plant-based default. My colleagues are going to go into more examples, but I just wanted to show one at the very beginning, just so you can kind of picture it. So here we can see we have some cilantro basmati rice, it looks like ginger tofu tiki masala, which looks really good actually. Now I'm kind of hungry. And we can see at the top here, there is a meat option that is available upon request. It is not visible to the public here. If they want it, they have to go to a little bit of an extra step. They have to take another step in order to get it, which would basically incentivize people to do the plant-based option, the more sustainable choice. If you want to see more examples, there are going to be plenty more later. But let's jump into how effective is this? Oh, sorry, one more thing. If we were to think about a diet as a spectrum, this is a little tofu and a carrot all the way up to steak on the right. If the vegans are on this side and the meat lovers are on this side, the target audience of a plant-based default is the people in the middle. So the flexitarians, the reducitarians, sometimes called the persuadables. These are the individuals who are most susceptible, who are going to be most swayed by these types of nudges. A vegan is going to choose a vegan option most of the time, or, all of the time. A meat lover is going to choose the meat option most of the time, but the people in the middle are the ones we are most concerned with. So, how effective are they? Is this worth pursuing? I've done research and I've reviewed over a dozen trials, and they are able to significantly increase the amount of veg meals ordered and eaten. The average increase goes from 17.2% up to 72.5%. In other words, when the meat is the default option, the veg option is chosen 17.2% of the time. When the veg option is defaulted, it goes up to 72.5% of the time. I was unable to find evidence of a correctly executed plant-based default program that failed to reduce the amount of meat consumed. And by correctly executed, I mean there was one program that I removed from the findings because the implementation was so poor, I don't think it could have been considered a default. And the study authors agreed. They didn't include it as well. So here is the evidence in a graph form. On the left here, we can see with no plant-based default, we can see that the veg option is chosen between 2% and about 31% of the time, depending on the type of option and the audience. When we do have a plant-based default, we're looking at about 58% of the time, all the way up to 89% of the time it being chosen. So to me, this is an extremely stark difference. Each of these results is statistically significant. And yeah, I just think in this case, the numbers really speak for themselves. This is very effective in reducing the amount of meat in a specific environment. Okay, a couple of considerations. As I alluded to before, I did exclude one study due to poor implementation. There is a limited scope with this research. The majority of this research tends to be conducted in relatively wealthy countries and developed countries, primarily English-speaking countries as well, with some other non-English-speaking countries in Europe. We don't know how much this would translate to countries outside of these regions. It hasn't been tested yet. And then finally, I don't know if there are long-term effects, either positive or negative effects. Some people believe that these types of things are able to shift social norms in terms of veganism and meat reduction. Some people believe that there's a possibility that people after a default program will eat more meat after. I have no idea about these as well. I would like to see more research before we make any definitive conclusions about this. I can say in the short term that these are quite effective and they're very statistically significant, and we can see that it is able to reduce meat consumption. There are many benefits. So from the institutional perspective, it may be able to reduce costs. One of my colleagues will jump into this program later, but the NYC hospitals are able to save money with a plant-based default program, specifically a whole foods plant-based program. They can reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the institution from between 23.6% and 42.7%. Like I mentioned earlier, this is a significant aim of these programs, and we are able to see some really good results here. And to me, this is the most significant benefit. I looked at 5 different approval ratings within the studies, and all of the approval ratings were above 90%. This basically means that the populations that we're working with like this. This is not likely to have a huge blowback, a huge pushback. People are unlikely to complain about this. Some campaigners may have noticed in the past that things like making an institution fully vegan or instituting meatless Mondays or things like that sometimes does have pushback from consumers or from the parents of children at a school, for example. Not always, but it is a risk that the campaigners are very concerned about. But here, because the choice is not entirely eliminated, the approval rating tends to be quite high. In a moment, I'm going to talk about some tips to make sure that these are very well successfully implemented. And then my colleagues are also going to jump into like the actual strategies of implementation. But overall, we can see that there are benefits just beyond the climate and for animals. Like the people like it, consumers like it, and institutions might be able to benefit as well. This is another finding. It's not the main point of today's webinar, but there are other ways that institutions can improve, can reduce meat consumption without doing an entire default. So by improving vegan ratios, which is, in other words, to say by increasing the amount of vegan or vegetarian options that are proportional to the entire menu, you can increase the orders by between 41 to 79%. And by improving the menu or other food labels of the items, we might be able to increase the orders by up to 38%. It could even be higher. I just couldn't find a study that went higher than this. So there are other ways that we can use nudges in institutions. In the full resources that are on the Better Food Foundation website and the Faunalytics website, you can see some more evidence and statistics about these other options. Okay, so now we can see the impact. What does the research say about how they can be improved? So number 1 is about training. As part of undergoing this research, I talked to and interviewed a few people who are working on these campaigns. And one of the biggest things that came up is that we need proper implementation, and that includes buy-in from the staff. So if a cafeteria staff worker doesn't understand why this is happening, they don't understand the words they should be using, they don't understand basically the overall goal or the ambition of this project, they're not really going to be motivated to see this through. So by being open, honest, direct, and forward-thinking, engaging with the staff is going to make the project a lot better. And you can imagine from the perspective of, a cafeteria worker, they might not understand essentially why this is happening. So we need to have a lot more basically open conversations. And some of my colleagues will be talking about the implementation about this as well later on. Okay, number 2, we're going to talk about labels for a second. If we have this, this vegan burger on a menu, what should we be calling it? Should we be calling it a vegan burger? No, we should not be using the word vegan burger on a menu to describe it. I personally am a vegan. I love it when a menu just says in big bold letters and big green letters, like this is the vegan option. It's just easy for me, makes my job as a consumer easier. But that's actually not the best way to reduce meat consumption from an institutional standpoint. So what's convenient for me is not convenient for the institution or for other consumers. So here are some other alternatives and other ways that we can kind of signal for the people to be more likely to choose it. The first would be verbiage like heart healthy, trying to indicate something related to health. Planet happy. Well, by the way, these are all examples from literature. These are not things I made up, which is some of these are a little bit funny, but they do the job. So indicating sustainability with words like planet happy burger. focusing on the origin of the taste or the origin of the food, for example, spicy Sichuan burger, and then entirely a taste-focused burger like umami, for example. So all of these types of examples are able to increase the ordering of that specific item, and they are able to make the item more appealing to consumers. And we could see that in the example from earlier. It didn't say vegan tofu. It said, I believe it was sesame, ginger, tiki masala tofu, something like that. I forget the exact verbiage, but it just kind of it made me a little bit hungry. It made me want to eat it. It didn't just say this is the vegan option, because that's only signaling to a small percentage of the population, whereas we want to be signaling to everybody here. I know something that's very common in the animal movement is to use the phrase plant-based. In the research, there's not a huge difference between vegan and plant-based. So using heart healthy, planet happy, things like this, the origin of the taste, these are going to be your best options. Okay, number 3 is to reach out to men and other meat lovers. There is a very large body of evidence that men are less likely to be vegan, take pro-animal action, or be swayed by nudges or vegan nudges. There are literally dozens of studies about this. Like I mentioned, because the target audience is flexitarians, you don't have to convince everybody. But if the audience you are working with is disproportionately male or potentially disproportionately athletes, or people who are very concerned about protein or anything like that, or disproportionately likely to be meat lovers, there are a couple of things that we can take into account here. So the first is, this is what I came up with this, macho menus, where we're essentially using masculine language to make the items more appealing. All of these are from the literature except for one. Number 1 is beast burger, meaty lasagna, high protein seitan, and swole sandwich. I made up swole sandwich. That's the fake one. The other 3 are all real from science. If you don't like academic literature, sometimes there's some funny stuff in there like this. So I do have to mention that the evidence on this is mixed. They're not always able to increase the orders, but the good news is that they failed to have any blowback or pushback. So I think it's worth a try with these quote unquote macho menus. The second is chef's selection, which is a nudge that was able to work for veg avoiders. By indicating a menu option was like selected by the chef or something like dish of the day or some other distinction, or it is able to get people who are less likely to try it, basically to order it. And then the final is ratios. Like I mentioned earlier, ratios are one of the other tools we have in our toolkit that work, and they tend to work for all demographic groups, including gender. We're going to jump into ratios more with my colleagues later on. Then we have, importantly, we need to make the foods inclusive. They need to be tasty. People are more likely to eat tasty food. I know that's a shocking finding from the literature, but it is true, in fact. They need to be appetizing, they need to be tasty, and allergy friendly. The inclusivity of plant-based defaults is a big bonus, and we're going to be hearing more about that in a moment, but it is something to be very mindful of. Finally, we're going to be talking about sequence. So worst case scenario, we can order the menus or even a buffet line, or even the way, like if you're working in a cafeteria, you can even order the way that the consumers approach the food itself to make people more likely to choose certain options. So if we have a menu, where would we want to put the vegan option? Either first or last. Items at the beginning of the end of the menu can potentially double their orders. And if it's first, it can reduce the total meat sold by 11%. This is from 2 different studies. Again, if you want to read the entire literature, I do recommend go to either the Faunalytics website or the Better Food Foundation website, where you can look into all of the sources here. By the way, just for the purposes of this sequence, I use the word vegan, but like I said earlier, should not be calling the menu item vegan. Use some other verbiage there. But yeah, order does matter. just like with the Spotify playlist. So we want to be sure to structure our buffets and menus accordingly. So that is it from me in terms of what the research is saying. I am going to pass the mic to my colleagues. They're going to be talking more about the implementation. If you have questions about the research or the science, I'm more than happy to answer those at the end of today's presentation. So thank you everybody for your time.
Thank you so much, Bjorn. This was really, really informative. And Bjorn did so much work on the research page that I put into the chat, and we'll also send that around later. So definitely check that out. It has like myriad of resources and sources and just all the information you could want. So thank you. Moving on to our next speaker. So I wanted to introduce Dr. Shabnam Islam from Greener by Default. She is an academic exercise physiologist and longtime educator who has dedicated her career to building healthier campus communities through student-led exercise and nutrition interventions for over a decade. She now serves as the academic director of Greener by Default, a nonprofit organization that uses behavioral science strategies to empower institutions to serve inclusive, sustainable, and delicious plant-forward food. With a doctorate in educational leadership and policy and a master's in kinesiology, Shabnam continues advocating for evidence-based, cost-effective, and collaborative approaches to enhance the health and inclusivity of academic institutions by making simple changes to the food environment on campuses. So take it away.
Thank you for that introduction, Laura, and also thank you to Bjorn for setting such a great foundation for why companies like organizations like Greener by Default actually exist. So let me go ahead and dive right into it. Again, my name is Shabnam Islam, and I am the academic director for Greener by Default. And for those of you who may not know who Greener by Default is, we are a nonprofit that empowers institutions with evidence-based consulting and hands-on guidance to serve inclusive, sustainable, and delicious plant-forward food. And I really believe that Bjorn set the foundation of why we are here. Why do organizations like GBD exist? Because what happens here, there is a simple and powerful solution to address all of the challenges that we experience in today's world, as Bjorn had shown, from animal welfare to climate issues, sustainability issues. And the solution is serving plant-forward menus. Because what we're seeing in the evidence is plant-based meals really do have a carbon footprint, and that is average half that of animal-based meals. And so this is just a really simple solution to cut carbon emissions. And like Bjorn said, inclusivity is a massive, massive, massive important topic. And oftentimes the hesitation to actually address the food being served is due to concerns about upsetting people, right? Because food is such a deeply personal and emotional topic, right? But the standard American diet, acronym, the SAD diet, is really not an inclusive way to serve food with meat and dairy at the center of every dish. Serving plant-forward menus is more inclusive of the 30 to 50 million Americans who are lactose intolerant, many of them who are majority the people of color. And so we also want to consider things like Buddhists, Hindus, Jains, Sikhs, Rastafarians, Seventh-day Adventists, and even those who identify as vegetarians. We also should consider religious practices, Jews and Muslims who don't even eat pork, right? We want to include them in our dietary practices. You also want to include more than half of all Americans who are trying to eat less red meat, and more than 1/3 of them that are trying to eat more plant-based food. And we also want to consider those communities of color who are 3 times more likely to identify as vegetarian. And what we are seeing is that Black Americans are actually the fastest growing demographic of vegans. So if we want to be inclusive, we need to think of serving everyone. And what does this actually look like in practice? Well, this is where Greener by Default comes into play to help institutions. And what we do is we use these behavioral science, or as Bjorn was saying, evidence-based nudge strategies to actually guide the food making decisions made by diners. And we use these 7 particular key strategies. And I'm just going to dive into them briefly for you. Greener by Default's core work is grounded in plant-based defaults, where the concept is to make the base of the meal plant-based and then obviously give people the option to opt in into meat and dairy. Now, this looks different across various food service environments, and I'm going to give you a few examples of that in just a moment. But when it's actually not possible to make the entire base meal entirely plant-based, we suggest climate-friendly ratios. This gives a perception that plant-based is the default by just offering a minimum of 2-to-1 veg to meat dishes on people's menus, right? A recent study found that actually when menus shift from having 2/3 meat options to 2/3 veg options, the selection of veg meals increases by 50%. 50%. Now, subtle substitutions are another easy and effective strategy. We suggest serving plant-based condiments, milks, desserts, and breads by default. We actually worked with one school district in Colorado who replaced their eggs and milk powder and all of their baked goods with oil, applesauce, and flax seeds. And you know what? They were able to save more than $10,000 annually and save as much carbon as driving over 50,000 miles. Now, oat milk defaults are another easy, subtle substitution that we suggest, where we make plant-based milks the default. And I'm going to talk to you briefly about what we did at LinkedIn that includes an oat milk default. Another strategy we utilize is called prime placement. This is what Bjorn said, an easy choice architecture strategy that makes sure that plant-based options are placed first and last in buffet lines and on menus, rather than keeping them in a completely different vegetarian section or a vegan station in a dining hall. Because according to the World Resources Institute, this increases plant-based selection of dishes by more than 50%. Now, along those same lines is another impactful strategy known as tasty titles. We are talking about labeling foods with names that are focused on taste, texture, provenance, like where they come from, rather than naming them vegan, vegetarian, or meatless. Because the World Resources Institute found that replacing the word meatless with flavor descriptors in a label increased sales by 76%. So maybe your meatless Mondays aren't the way to go when it comes to actually changing behavior. So the final strategy that works in tandem with all of these others is reducing the portion size of meat dishes that actually do contain animal protein. And this could be as simple as blending meats with plant-based options like beef and mushrooms, or it could be as simple as reducing a scoop size. There was a study done at Stanford University that found that you could reduce the amount of meat in burritos by 25% with no change in diner satisfaction. And remember, as Bjorn said, we're here to meet those flexitarians, those people in the middle. So as vegans and vegetarians, we may identify with the fact that meat reduction may not be a strategy that even crosses our mind. However, we are here to change the minds of people in a very subtle way. And so these are some key strategies that we utilize at Greener by Default. And I'm sure you're probably wondering, how do these strategies actually work in practical application? And that's what I'm here to showcase for you today. So Greener by Default actually partnered with researchers at UCLA, Harvard, and a few other academic institutions to study the impact of plant-based defaults on meal choice at catered events. So this is an RSP event where people were actually filling out an RSVP form to get a meal at this event. Now, in the control condition, we found that when meat was the default and people could request a plant-based option, less than 20% of people actually requested a plant-based meal. But when plant-based was the default and people could actually request a meat meal, on average, 2/3 of people stuck with the plant-based default and 1/3 requested a meat meal. Now, this is approximately a 50 percentage point increase in the number of people eating plant-based meals simply by us switching the default. Better yet, this didn't upset people in a way by making everybody eat a plant-based default. Why? Because the people who actually really wanted meat, they could opt into it if they wanted it. It was just no longer the default option for everyone. And so not only did the results show that this strategy effectively increased plant-based meal selection by 47% across all institutions, this shift had significant environmental impact. What we did see was an approximate 40% reduction in all of the following: food-related greenhouse gas emissions, reduction in land use, nitrogen, and even phosphorus footprint. So what this actually demonstrates is that plant-based default menu options are really effective. They provide a low effort, high impact way to decrease carbon footprint through university-based catered events while doing what we do best, maintaining the freedom of choice for diners. Now, we also did a default test in another food service environment. So in the serving up plants by default study that Björn was talking about briefly before, here we had 3 universities that implemented plant-based defaults within all-you-carry-eat dining halls. So on control days, both the meat dish and the plant-based dish of the same version, they were served side by side. And on the intervention days, the plant-based default option was presented as the main option, and the meat version of the dish was hidden from the students but available by request. And I'm showing you the same picture here. This is depicted at Lehigh University that showcases that meal that makes Bjorn hungry, ginger tofu tikka masala, right? It's the only visible option at the station. And you can see right above it is a small sign next to a little meat meal card that says chicken tikka masala, and it notifies the students that that meat version is available upon request, right? So they have to go do that extra step to opt into that meat. But here are the key findings of the results. When defaults are implemented consistently, and I say consistently because I'm emphasizing that having buy-in by your food service staff is really important. When their defaults are implemented consistently, over 50% more plant-based dishes are offered, which leads to an increased take rate of plant-based foods. Now, this increased take rate of plant-based foods led to a 24% reduction of food-related greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I want to say that there is one site that didn't have proper implementation because their food service location was always understaffed. And so on plant-based default days, they often had to move chefs from one station to another who didn't have the understanding of what was happening at that station. And so when students were requesting the plant-based default, like the ginger tofu tikka masala, some food service staff would say, like, are you sure you want that? And so that would impact whether the student took the dish. And so this is why we say when defaults are implemented consistently and done well, the impact is great. But when they're not implemented consistently, it's like the impact of the default completely vanishes. Now, these strategies don't just work in university settings. They also work in healthcare too. Greener by Default worked with New York City Health and Hospitals to pilot plant-based defaults for their patient lunches. So how this worked is that they offered patients with 2 plant-based chef specials, and they used flavorful global cuisines that really reflected the diversity and the preferences of their patient population. And remember, this is New York City, so you have to really consider the dynamic, diverse population there, right? So if the patients didn't want either of those chef specials, they were then allowed to choose from a static menu of meat dishes. And what they found was that more than half of those patients selected plant-based meals. And approximately 95% of patients who chose the plant-based meal were satisfied with their choice. Now, this pilot was so successful that they've now implemented plant-based defaults for all patient meals across 11 of their hospitals, shifting 800,000 meals annually. Now, what this does is this saves about 59 cents per meal, but really that's about $500,000 per year, which also reduces their carbon footprint of their entire food program by 1/3. Now that is impact, ladies and gentlemen. So let me tell you a little bit about LinkedIn now. Greener by Default works with LinkedIn and its food service provider, Good Eating Company, to develop a food program that promoted plant-based eating to help LinkedIn reach their sustainability goals of trying to reach carbon negativity by 2030. Okay. So we phased in a program at LinkedIn San Francisco that focused on several strategies to really help their employees make climate-friendlier choices, right? And these strategies included climate-friendly ratios, or serving more plant-based foods than animal-based foods. We limited serving carbon-intensive meats like beef and lamb to just one entree per week. And we also relabeled dishes with tasty titles, ensuring that these dishes were described by their ingredients rather than by qualities such as vegan or meatless. Now, as a result, LinkedIn was able to serve half as much meat per person, which is equivalent to saving as much carbon as driving 35,000 miles. That's huge. And even with this 50% reduction of meat per person, LinkedIn maintained high diner satisfaction. And that is important when we talk about creating sustainable changes. When we spoke with Chef Alicia, which is the Good Eating Company's culinary director at LinkedIn, she was actually surprised to report that diners had more beneficial things to say than negative things to say regarding their meat reduction efforts at LinkedIn. Here is what a diner actually reported. I've noticed an increase in vegetarian food variety and protein options. So I want to thank you. It means a lot, and it's helping me take better care of my health. So nudge strategies really, really work. The last strategy at LinkedIn that we implemented was an oat milk default in their coffee bar. And to do so, what LinkedIn did is they posted signage that dairy, soy, and almond milk were available by request, but oat milk was the default. The result of this was that this cut dairy milk from 70% to 18% of milk being served. This reduced their carbon footprint by 50%. So all of these strategies are incredibly impactful. So what Greener by Default is here to say is, if you are an internal ally or a key decision maker at an institution who's really ready to make sustainable and impactful change, we at GBD would love to talk with you, would love to speak with you and work with you to pilot these strategies at your organization. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this and toss it to Laura, because now she's going to tell us how to bring everybody on board.
Thank you so much, Shabnam. Really appreciate your presentation, and it's really cool to see the profound impacts of these strategies in your case studies. So I'm going to move right along. I know we're a little short on time, so hopefully if you all have questions, you can stay over just a couple of minutes to get your questions answered. If not, we're happy to answer them afterwards with over email. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And all right, so as I said, my name's Laura, and I'm going to talk about Default Veg, which is an initiative of the Better Food Foundation. So what is Default Veg? So I know there's probably a lot of confusion about BFF versus Greener by Default and Default Veg versus Greener by Default. So I want to help make this really clear for everybody so we can just work together more smoothly running forward. So basically Default Veg, it's the same concept as Greener by Default. It's the same idea of using plant-based defaults to shift meals, as well as other nudges like what Björn and Shabnam already talked about. But Default Veg is our campaign, our initiative's name, to have it wrapped up in a nice name that we can use as kind of an advocacy tool, as a momentum building tool. Our advocates we work with really love this name. Students really love it, integrating it into their campus campaigns. And so Default Veg is, it's basically our name for this work. And the way we use Default Veg is that we build momentum for plant-based defaults and nudges through advocacy trainings, partnerships, and narrative building, which I'll go into a little bit more in the following slides. And so we offer trainings to advocates and our partner groups to support their institutional work and help them generate leads and help them get these strategies accepted by decision makers in their communities, on their campuses, in their office spaces. And we also support them with publicity and narrative building. And this basically builds more excitement around these concepts in that sector, in whatever sector they're working in. And that helps to increase uptake of the strategies. And we especially have been working in universities and cities, which you'll see a little bit more about later. We also help generate institutional leads through webinars, conferences, and a lot of outreach in spaces where sustainability professionals are present. And also just a quick note, although we use the branding Default Veg, we don't require our advocates or partner groups to do that if they find that using something like plant-based by default is more amenable to the decision makers that they're working with. So I want to talk about the two main ways that we support the movement. And the first is through our Default Veg Student Ambassador Program. So Default Veg campaigns, as the other speakers talked about, these strategies are a lot less maybe confrontational and restrictive than going and trying to pass something like a meat ban or a meat reduction initiative, because they protect choice. And so with our ambassadors, we really empower them to be resources for their campus and not to be, running pressure campaigns and being sort of oppositional with those in charge. So we're really emphasizing collaboration over confrontation. Again, like I said, we provide trainings, resources, sample materials, and a sense of community for our ambassadors to really be effective and to be able to engage with each other and build, ideas off of each other's works. And we offer several different tracks, including working on dining halls, events and conferences, offices and departments, and just general public outreach on their campus to build momentum. And we can help them with their overall campaign strategy. We also have a course module for professors to introduce these concepts into their classrooms, and we offer an internship program for students to get more directly involved with us and really dig into the work on a higher level. And this is something that can be integrated into people's existing clubs, so they don't have to start a new Default Veg club to do this work. It's a set of strategies that can really be just added to and bolster any sort of work that students are already doing. And I'm going to be sharing some of the wins that our ambassadors have achieved. And I wanted to also note that we have a really longstanding partnership with New Roots Institute, who they have a fellowship program, and every semester we work with students there, and they have achieved a lot of these victories. So I wanted to shout out that partnership and give some credit to them. So as Shabnam was talking about, the Oat Milk by Default initiative is a really effective way to change cafe norms. And it's also really, really popular with our students. And I think that's just because oat milk is really trending right now. It's really popular, and it's also a huge way to address the footprint of dairy on campus. So these are just some of the colleges and universities we've worked with to do oat milk defaults or similar programs. And I wanted to share specifically a couple of these. At University of San Diego, they ran 2 pilots of an oat milk default, and they were so successful that they removed the upcharge for oat milk across campus. And at Cornell, which is really interesting because they have a dairy farm on campus, they have actually not only removed the upcharge for non-dairy milks, but also removed the dairy default, meaning that every time someone orders, they're asked what milk they want. And so it makes it easier for people to choose plant milk. So it's not quite as far as a plant milk default, but still a big step, especially on a campus that revolves around dairy so much. We also support our ambassadors with publicity. And so these are just some of the things we've done, helping them make flyers and getting those up on campus, bringing out influencers to post about the success of these programs on their channels and help get more people interested in them, and getting media coverage as well. Some quick other highlights from our ambassadors. So these are some of the same strategies that we already talked about, and just in practice, I'm sharing a few of them. So at Cornell and Claremont McKenna, they were able to get ingredient swaps into some of their baked goods. So these baked goods are now vegan by default instead of, having butter or other animal ingredients. Some students have also done menu redesigns where they get plant-based options, either moved more throughout the menu or moved more to the top so that more people will order them. And then a really popular one a lot of our students engage with is the clubs and departments track, where they can just rack up as many commitments to using Default Veg for departments and clubs events as possible. So you can see NYU students have gotten over 12, Northwestern students have gotten 7 or more. And then I wanted to jump into how we partner with other groups in the movement. And I think this is actually the biggest probably takeaway for today. So hopefully you guys can stick around for a few more minutes. So we are part of a growing ecosystem of experts, advocates, and change makers who are helping to make plant-based foods the norm across different industries and sectors. And I love this photo because it's from the Good Food Purchasing Programs Conference that they did in the spring in Washington, D.C. And we helped them. They're a big basically network that gets better and more ethical food standards in place at institutions. And they recently incorporated plant-based defaults as a recommendation through our work. And we got to work with them on their conference to bring plant-based defaults to their conference. So that was really cool. So here are just a couple of examples of how we've supported our partner groups. So in Austin, Texas, we've supported Planted Society. They do these awesome vegan month-long challenges, and we worked with them in Austin, Texas to help the Office of Sustainability commit to Default Veg, and we're continuing to work with that office as they work on their food plan and trying to get these strategies more integrated throughout the community of Austin. And this is just an event that we held with City Council where we gave them a new veggie design take on the Texas flag. And then in Washington, D.C., we supported DC Veg Week. And we also worked with, we worked with some of their restaurants to give them more plant-forward menu tips. And then we also gave a veggie sculpture to the City Council because of their plant-forward work, which actually Friends of the Earth actually achieved getting this legislation passed to really never before seen city level bill where they committed to a certain percentage reduction in their meat related greenhouse gas emissions. And so we've been working with the government on an ongoing basis to help implement some of the strategies of plant-based defaults and other nudges as part of implementing that plan. We've also supported groups like the Plant-Based Cities movement. They recently got the University of Victoria to switch to plant-based cheese and mayo as a default, and we supported them there, as well as a ski resort that we've been working with them in Vermont. So we offer a lot of support to our partner groups just to help them kickstart these strategies in the work that they're already doing. So to get into more specifics of how we do that, like I mentioned before, we offer training resources. We also kind of serve a project management role where we can help bring all the pieces together across all the organizations working on these strategies and help manage the project, including managing any grants that we get, and also helping them with publicity after they've had successes. So we do that by collecting data, and we actually have a new tool, which I'll send out to everybody later, where those institutions or events or anywhere that's using plant-based default can report their data and their successes. And we are compiling this into a database where we'll work with faculty at the University of San Diego's new Center for Food Systems Transformation, and just try to draw out any interesting conclusions, potentially use this for a future resource, and also importantly for public awareness projects, drawing attention to the success stories of our partners. And then we can also provide referrals to groups that can help achieve large-scale dining changes. So for example, Greener by Default. Our latest tools and resources. So like I mentioned, we have that new survey that I'll send out. And then we also have another survey that we've just put out that is for institutions that are interested in implementing some of these nudges and need some help. So it's kind of like this choose your own adventure tool where they fill out the survey and it pops out recommendations for them as they go along. And again, this is a way that we generate leads, and then we can plug in these people with groups like Greener by Default when they need more intensive support. We also have a forthcoming report on oat milk defaults that I'm excited to be able to share with you all when that's available. And we are starting up a new working group, which many of you probably already saw and signed up for, where we'll just take all of this work to a new level by making sure that everyone in the movement who's using these strategies is well coordinated, supporting each other, sharing ideas with each other, and just really strengthening this work. And lastly, we have some talking points that'll also send around soon to help groups talk about their successes to the media and, really convey how powerful these strategies are, as well as how they're not restrictive. They're inclusive. They don't take away choices. And that is a really important piece of the puzzle when we're trying to get, more buy-in to changes, because, people don't like taking away choices. And so this is one of the really powerful talking points associated with these strategies. And then lastly, we've already kind of done some of this, but I just really wanted to sum up the differences between our two groups so that you will know who to go to moving forward and how we can support you. So Better Food Foundation and our Default Veg initiative, we work to strengthen our movement's work on defaults and nudges. And we do that by, providing resources, providing one-on-one support, and now moving forward, helping coordinate this work between many groups. We also generate leads, particularly in sustainability spaces. So we're really interested in getting more and more sustainability professionals, as well as the climate movement, on board with these strategies. And then we provide trainings and resources, and I mentioned our data collection and media support. So our audiences are students, our partner orgs, sustainability professionals, and the environmental movement. Greener by Default, on the other hand, as Shabnam covered, they do institutional consulting and guidance on nudges and defaults. So really getting into specific strategies, how these strategies can work in practice, and looking at institutions' menus and really giving them those tips on a really practical level. They conduct pilots with these institutions to test nudges and calculate their impact for long-term change. So really, you're going to want to go to Greener by Default if you need that hands-on help for an institution that you're working with. And then their audience is key stakeholders at these institutions. So this may be internal allies, somebody who's a staff member there who can help get the wheels turning, food service management operators, and dining directors. So again, we work with student and allies to help gain interest from stakeholders. And if we get to a point where we can no longer support these decision makers and they're ready to implement, we can connect them with Greener by Default, and we can help manage that process and support it, as well as help with publicity. So if you're a student or an advocate, which I think many people here in the audience are advocates, and you want support for plant-based default work, then you can connect with us, and we will, we'll plug you into the working group, and we will help you get started with that momentum. And then if you're an internal ally who's already ready to try to move forward with these strategies, that's when you can bring in Greener by Default. And lastly, here's my email address, laura@betterfoodfoundation.org. So if you have questions about this and need more information, you can reach me. And then I will go ahead and stop sharing. I know we're over time, but if anyone does want to stay and have any questions answered, we can just do for like 2 or 3 minutes and try to get the biggest questions answered. So I have my colleague Julie here. If you would like to jump in and bring up any of those questions. And if anyone has to go, just look out for the recording, and then you can see the Q&A once you see the recording. So thank you so much.
Laura, we answered the questions in chat since we were running out of time, because I know that we're over. So we were able to do that. So if you want to
okay, perfect.
Yes.
Yeah, so thank you. Save lots of time. So we're just a couple minutes over. Well, thank you all so much for joining. Again, we'll send you an email with everything you need moving forward. And I look forward to seeing most of you all in our working group. So thank you.